We're going to get started. So welcome to Building the Path, Assessment to Cleanup, and how to maximize your assessment to prepare for cleanup. This webinar will be recorded and available on our website, and which will be the Center for Creative Land Recycling website. You will receive, after this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with the slides and a recording. You will also receive some evaluation questions, which we would really appreciate if you provide some feedback on. Next slide, please. As you can see on the slide, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a series of different icons. So if you would like to send comments during the webinar, use the chat box. And if you have a question, please use the Q&A box so we can address it at the end of the webinar. There will be some time. You may also see a response during the webinar if somebody's available to answer the question. Next slide, please. Again, welcome and thank you for joining. I will introduce our speakers today. My name is Tamara Cardona-Marek, and I will be your host and one of the speakers. I'm a senior Brownfields consultant working for the Center of Creative Land Recycling, or CCLR. I'm an environmental scientist, and prior to working for CCLR, I worked in the regulatory arena for over 15 years for the states of Washington and Alaska. Tena Seeds is a licensed professional engineer and cleanup site manager at the Washington State Department of Ecology. Tina has over 25 years of experience, with 20 of those as an environmental consultant. She earned a bachelor's degree in civil engineering at the University of Washington. We also have Marc Thomas, and he has been managing the Brownfields program for the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation since 2019. His team manages Brownfields assessment and cleanup projects, provides technical support, including outreach and training to Alaskan communities. Prior to moving to Alaska, Marc worked with the U.S. EPA's Office of Land and Emergency Management. And we also have on the line to help answer questions, Ali Fermal from the Department of Ecology in Washington and Rebecca Wells-Albers from the DEQ in Oregon. So please feel free to put your questions for them on the chat, on the Q&A also. Next slide, please. This webinar has been organized by the Center for Creative Land Recycling, or CCLR again. CCLR is EPA's technical assistance to brownfields provider for EPA's regions 9 and 10. Next slide, please. This slide shows you some of the ways in which CCLR can assist communities, which include one-on-one assistance, grant application assistance, and webinars like this one. This webinar is part of what we do to help you get started and stay on track with your Brownfields project. We're going to launch quickly a couple of questions on a poll to help us know, give us a better idea of our audience, and also to learn how much you know about Brownfields, and hopefully that will help us kind of answer your questions and target the information we're going to provide you. So I'll give this a minute, and in the meantime, we're going to jump into the next slide. And let's talk about what we're going to talk about. And this slide shows you a quick outline and very briefly describes how we're going to go through this webinar. We start with the basics, and we're going to provide some very general background and the objectives of the webinar, give you a little bit of context on the Brownfields grants, and which is important. But if you are not interested in applying for a grant or don't know about grants right now, don't worry, don't feel like this isn't for you. There's plenty of information outside of the grant context that will be useful to you. And also, if you're not in Region 10, also it's okay, even though we will provide some specific information about Region 10 states, there's also plenty of information about cleanup and assessment that will be useful to you. And quickly, the results of our questions, we have about 22% of local government, 10% nonprofit, 2% tribal entities, 10% federal agencies, 27% state agencies, and 29% of the private sector. And then we have People that are not working on a project right now, 39%. 15 are working on site selection and planning. Assessment, 34% are working on assessment. That's great. And 12% are working on cleanup. Great. Thanks everyone for sharing that information. We're going to go on to the next slide. So jumping on right into our background information and the general definition of brownfields, also the EPA definition is posted in this slide. Essentially, brownfields are an underutilized property that is vacant or abandoned due to the uncertainty of potential contamination. Next slide, please. So how do we overcome that uncertainty? Because that uncertainty can feel like a daunting task, and there can be confusion on where to start, what is the role of a phase 1 and a phase 2, and what's even a phase 1 and a phase 2, and what to do if you find contamination. So with that in mind, we've set the goals of this webinar as the following. First one is to provide you the knowledge to be prepared to maximize the resources that you have for brownfield assessment. The second one is to make you familiar with the steps of the cleanup process so you can make better decisions about funding, and so you can also better understand what can and can't be funded with your grant money. And our third goal is to make you aware of the regulatory agencies, their role, and what is the right time to contact them and bring them into your project. Next slide, please. In 2021, CCLR presented a webinar called It's Just a Phase that also focused on how to best use a phase 2 environmental site assessment. So if you haven't watched this webinar, it is on our website, and I encourage you to do so. It's a great kind of set to this webinar. It complements it. So if you would like more information, there will be a link on the slides that will be sent to you after this. Next slide, please. So with the context of the EPA Brownfields grant, it's important to this webinar. Brownfields reuse is a way to give properties new life. It can help increase local tax bases, facilitate job growth, and improve and protect the environment, which is especially important and beneficial for disadvantaged communities. With those benefits in mind, the EPA's Brownfields program provides funding for brownfields assessment, for cleanup, for training, for technical assistance, and research. The two main sources of funding listed on the screen are through sections 128A and 104 of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA. And these two types of funding, in short, are called STRP and MARC. STRP grants are for states and tribes to create and enhance their environmental response programs, and they can include assessment and sometimes some cleanup, but at a smaller scale than the MARC grants. The MARC grants, and MARC stands for Multi-Purpose Assessment, Revolving Loan Fund, and Cleanup, are they're competitive grants, and they provide funding. The multi-purpose one specifically provides for assessment and cleanup. Then you have the Assessment, Revolving Loan Fund, and Cleanup grants. We're going to go to the next slide and talk about assessment grants. So assessment grants, which is the biggest focus of our webinar today, and we're going to start with our part 1 of the webinar. They provide funding for a grant recipient to do a variety of things, including these listed on the screen. Their planning activities or environmental activities. For example, they provide funding to inventory, characterize, assess, and conduct a range of planning activities. You can also do site-specific cleanup plans. You can do community engagement. These are some of the general things you can do with a grant. Let's go to the next slide. However, when we specifically talk about what is really an assessment, and this is actually the definition that's in the guidelines Q&A for the EPA assessment grants, is assessment is the process of evaluating whether or not there is contamination on a property. So is it there or is it not there? Also evaluating the extent of contamination prior to doing cleanup, and also evaluating the cleanup alternatives once you know the extent of the contamination. So While assessment grants are primarily intended to do these things and conduct environmental site assessment, there are a lot of other activities that you can do under an assessment grant. So that is why it is so important to plan and to have your final goals in mind. What do you want to do in the end of a grant? Or what do you want to do with your funds? And where are you trying to get to? So let's go to the next slide. This list covers many of the planning activities that can be done under an assessment grant. So as you can see, and this list is from the EPA website, it includes from brownfields inventories to market studies, site reuse visions, resource roadmaps. So there's a lot you can do with your assessment grant. When we jump to the next slide, you have the environmental activities that you can do with your assessment grant also, which includes your phase 2. You can also, I should clarify, you can also do your phase 1 under an assessment grant. You can do a phase 2, you can do your hazardous materials survey, you can do pilot and treatability studies, all these things. And the things you want to do with your assessment grant depends on what you know about the property, how much you know at the point you have access to a property, and how far do you need to go with the assessment grant? Is this just a check-in of whether there's contamination or not, or are you intending to delineate the contamination? So in most cases, if you find contamination during your phase 2, then you're going to need to do a lot more. You're going to need to do your feasibility study. You may need to do additional delineation, and you may even need to do a selection of cleanup alternatives, which in EPA note calls an analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives, or APCA. So it's really important to know where you want to go with your assessment. Next slide, please. So phase 1 environmental site assessment. What is a phase 1? Well, generally, when you begin to think or work with a brownfield property, a phase 1 either has been done or is in the process of getting done. So what is really a phase 1? It's part of the due diligence process, and it's key to support your what they call the circular liability defense if you're purchasing a contaminated property. So, however, it is really also the start of your environmental activities, because from an assessment perspective, and when we're thinking of that, like whether there's contamination or not, what is the extent of the contamination, your phase 1 is going to help you find, it's going to help you determine where to go next. Is the findings of the phase 1, which are called recognized environmental conditions. So those recognized environmental conditions are going to help you set the goals of your phase 2. For example, your phase 1 may identify an old underground storage tank, or it may identify a property nearby that had contamination that has migrated onto the property that you're interested in. So these findings, or recognized environmental conditions, RECs, will help you determine where to go with your phase 2. Next slide, please. And this diagram is intended to show the general steps of the process. So if you see where your phase 1 starts, or where the whole process starts, really, if you don't have RECs, or recognized environmental conditions, then maybe your process has ended and you don't need to do any more. If you do find recognized environmental conditions, then you want to move towards your phase 2, or it may also be called, your consultant may be calling it an assessment, but the next step will be to investigate those recognized environmental conditions. Unless they're already investigated, maybe somebody did it a few years ago and there's information available. But the next thing you're going to do is look at those RECs. You're going to look at what they mean and how much you need to do. So how do you maximize the scope of your assessment in your phase 2 to get the most out of your available funding? So I'm going to transition to Tina to talk about that, our part 2.
Thanks, Tamara. Hi, everyone. I'm Tena Seeds with the Washington State Department of Ecology. And I'm going to go through part 2 of our webinar now. We'll talk about what a phase 2 is, what it isn't, defining the goals and objectives of the assessment work. And I'll also talk about the conceptual site model, which is an important part of this process. And then after that, I'll go through how you can maximize the activities under a phase 2. Next slide. All right, so what is a phase 2? Well, the previous webinar called It's Just a Phase, that provided some detail into the phase 2 environmental assessment and went over specific case studies. For this discussion, we'll look at the phase 2 in the brownfields redevelopment context. So a phase 2 is a term that's used for an investigation that's designed to assess the presence of contamination. And that means looking at potentially impacted media like soil, groundwater, soil vapors, and indoor air. There's an ASTM standard for performing a phase 2 environmental site assessment, but the structure and contents depends on your overall objectives. So when you have limited knowledge of what might be found at a site and have limited funding to perform investigation, it's really critical to do whatever you can to get the most out of your phase 2 assessment. The phase 2 is primarily performed on the subject property, and that requires that you have access to the property either through ownership or through an access agreement to be able to perform the investigation work. Sometimes you can also have a need for sampling or investigation beyond the property boundaries of some offsite investigation work, and that too would likely require an access agreement from the property owner, or if it's in a public right-of-way, you may need a special permit from the local municipality. So again, we encourage you to watch the previous CCLR webinar called It's Just a Phase for some additional details on the phase 2. Next slide. So the main elements of a phase 2 environmental site assessment are again shown on this diagram. As Tamara mentioned, it's performed after the phase 1 assessment has been completed during that preliminary planning and due diligence phase, and recognized environmental conditions, or RECs, have been identified for the subject property. The work plan, that's where you want to document your goals and objectives, and those are informed by what you're going to do with the property and what the results of the phase 1 showed, as well as what you already know or suspect about environmental conditions at the site, and that's what we refer to as the preliminary conceptual site model, or CSM. So after you design the phase 2 assessment, you perform the field work and then review the results to determine whether to continue that iterative process of additional sampling and analysis and refining that conceptual site model, or move forward and evaluate cleanup options. There's a number of activities that are typically performed under a phase 2, like the soil and groundwater sampling, some risk assessment work, and things like that. And I'll talk about that more later on. Just remember that the scope and methods of a phase 2 can vary depending on the site and on applicable regulations, as well as the overall assessments, the assessment goals and objectives. Next slide. All right, so what are the goals of the phase 2? What are the objectives? You'll want to establish your goals and objectives in that when you're developing that work plan. That will help to define the scope of work for your phase 2 assessment. Defining an adequate scope of work, a comprehensive scope of work, that's really key to getting the most out of your assessment grant and preparing you for potential site cleanup. So think about, how is that property going to be reused? What is that redevelopment going to look like? What are the results of the phase 1 show? Have any of the recognized environmental conditions been investigated? Is there more investigation that's needed? Do you already know that there's contamination at the property? And if so, do you know what the extents, both laterally and vertically, of that contamination? So again, think about the future use of the property to really determine what you need to know at this stage. Future uses will also help in the development of appropriate cleanup levels for the cleanup action for the property. So, who's going to be using the site and what is going to need to happen to make it protective for those users. Developers use information from a phase 2 environmental site assessment to make potential future development and land use decisions, as well as design considerations for their projects. Next slide. All right, so where do we start? The best place to start is with the conceptual site model, that's CSM. What pieces of information do we already know about the site? So according to ITRC, which is the Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council, a really great resource that's out there, a conceptual site model shows the relationship in 3 dimensions between contaminant sources and receptors through potential and actual migration and exposure pathways. It further states that the CSM should be maintained and updated as new information is collected throughout the life cycle of a project. So this means it's a dynamic and iterative process that evolves over the course of site investigation and cleanup efforts. Next slide. All right, so let's define some of these terms to make sure we're all on the same page. And I'm sure there's a number of you out there who are probably already familiar with these. So sources refers to the sources of contamination, what caused the contamination to be released into the environment. Receptors is who or what will ultimately be impacted by the contamination. So people, animals, bugs, etc. Migration pathway is how the contamination will reach the receptor. What's the transport mechanism and what medium is it moving through? So soil, groundwater, air. And then exposure pathway, that refers to the route that the contaminant will impact the receptor. So for us humans, that would be things like ingestion and direct contact, dermal absorption, inhalation, things like that. Next slide. All right, and this is a general illustration of a conceptual site model. It gives you that visual of the relationship between the sources and receptors and those migration and exposure pathways. So in this particular example, you can see that chemicals have leaked out of those drums and gotten into the soil and groundwater where it can then get into a local stream. Or into the water supply for that house, if somebody is bathing in that. There can be vapors coming off of the subsurface contamination and enter that house through vapor intrusion where it can be inhaled. You can have contaminated vapor and dust emissions and outside air that can move to different areas. So this is a pretty comprehensive view or look at a general conceptual site model. And I have some other examples of CSMs that that I've gotten for a couple of the sites that I'm working on, and I'll show those in a minute. So with all of this in mind, think about what types of questions you should ask during the development of the conceptual site model and as you're developing your scope of work for your phase 2 assessment. Are groundwater samples necessary? Is vapor intrusion a potential concern? Is there a nearby surface water that could be potentially impacted? Are there sensitive species around? So again, think about these things when you're developing your preliminary conceptual site model and getting ready to scope out your assessment. Next slide. All right, so what can the conceptual site model do? Again, it can help to establish the scope of your assessment. It can identify areas of uncertainty about the site and provide a platform for evaluating data gaps, and it can also help to prioritize aspects of investigation and cleanup. The development of an accurate conceptual site model is really vital to the project, and it's so important for the decision-making process for a site. One thing to also note is that the site can be more than just a property. The conceptual site model might show that the site, in terms of where contamination is present, that could include multiple properties or parcels. It may not be confined to a single property. You may have off-site sources of contamination, or you may have contamination from the subject property moving off property, migrating down gradient. So this type of information is really important for making decisions about the site, about cleanup. It may also shed light into potential deal breakers for purchase or redevelopment of a property. And then one other thing about the conceptual site model, once data gaps are addressed, that the conceptual site model is further refined, and then it can help to identify possible cleanup alternatives for you. Next slide. All right, so where do we start when developing the conceptual site model? Again, look at the results of the phase 1 assessment, as well as other historical records and photographs and other information you have about the site to see what's already known. What are the recognized environmental conditions? What were the former uses of the property? What are the site features, both historical features, current features? Could any of the former uses or features have caused contamination? This information will really help to piece together that preliminary conceptual site model and identify a scope of work that's necessary to investigate the site. All right, next I have some examples that I can show. So next slide. All right. And so, this is an example of one type of conceptual site model that's commonly used. This one is specific to a commercial dry cleaning facility that historically operated in Seattle. This one was prepared by PES Environmental, a local consulting firm we have here. It shows what sources of contamination have been identified at the site, which is on the left portion of this diagram. In that middle section, that's where it shows what the contaminant transport mechanisms and pathways to exposure are. And then over to the right there, it shows who are the receptors that could be exposed to the contamination, both future receptors as well as current receptors. So there's different types of conceptual site models that can be prepared, including flowchart diagrams like this one. But you can also have graphical ones that include illustrations and imagery, and it can also be explained in written form in the text of a document. And I've seen it usually in a combination where there's it's in written form in a report, and there's an attached diagram or figure to provide a visual for it. Next slide. All right, and this is an example of another type of CSM, a graphical conceptual site model. The image shown here and the graphics that are on the next slide, they're part of the same conceptual site model for a site that I've been working on. These were prepared by another local environmental consulting firm called Floyd Snyder. So I just want to make a shout out to Floyd Snyder. Thank you for allowing us to use the great imagery that you've prepared. So this was for a large contaminated site that's located near a waterway in the Seattle area. The facility historically operated as actually a bulk fuel terminal and had a machine shop and maintenance shop and various other industrial type of operations on it. Petroleum hydrocarbons and chlorinated solvents, metals, and some other contaminants were released to the environment here during its former operations. The green shading on this particular image, that represents the chlorinated solvents that were released in one area of the site. So this particular site is currently being cleaned up, actually, and it's going to be redeveloped with multiple industrial office buildings and I think a restaurant, as well as some additional commercial retail spaces and a self-storage facility, I think. All right, so next slide. All right, and then this is a really great graphic here. This is a three-dimensional illustration of the conceptual site model for this same site. It shows everything on there. You can see the sources of contamination and the approximate extents of the plumes at this site. There's the petroleum contamination, that's that orange shading over by the bulk fuel tanks, and the solvent plume, which is the green shaded area that's extending from the former rail spurs that went on the property, and it's in that oil and solvent storage area. So conceptual site models like this one, they really help to understand the impacts of the contamination to soil and groundwater, as well as surface water bodies, like this is Salmon Bay, for instance, and also to human and ecological receptors. But not all of this information will be necessary for every site. This is a pretty complex site that had a lot of things going on with it. It all depends on the number of sources and types of contaminants and the features of the property. And these property features, like the tank yard and the solvent storage area, those are features that would likely be identified as recognized environmental conditions during a phase 1 assessment. And those are the types of findings that we'd be looking for that would help in the development of a preliminary conceptual site model and for putting together the scope of work for the assessment. Next slide. All right, so how do you get from not knowing the conditions of a property, or maybe only knowing some of it, to this complex conceptual site model? And what's the path that you need to take to get from a preliminary CSM to a really comprehensive, fully developed conceptual site model like this one? And I'll talk about that next. Next slide. Okay, so now we'll go through the process of, getting through the assessment work and defining the conceptual site model to be able to get to the cleanup phase and reuse the property. So first, identify the objectives. Those will be based on what the intent of the work is. Are you looking to understand the risks and extent of contamination? Do you want to be able to develop an appropriate cleanup action? How will the property be reused? What will that redevelopment look like? Develop a conceptual site model based on what you know, and then determine what needs to be further investigated and what information you need to fill in the data gaps about the site. And ultimately, develop a comprehensive scope of work for the assessment that will result in giving you enough information to complete the conceptual site model and select an appropriate cleanup action. All right, next slide. I'll go through what's all involved in a phase 2 assessment. So this is a fun little image showing the pathway from site assessment to development of a cleanup action. So yeah, there's some common tasks that you can include in your assessment, like soil sampling. Soil samples are collected from various locations across the site to assess the presence of contaminants. As I mentioned earlier, this could also include sampling in areas beyond the property boundary, so outside of the property. Focus on the areas where you expect contamination and sample for the contaminants that make the most sense based on what's known about the property and its past uses. Also, consider setting a maximum number of soil samples to be able to estimate the cost for this scope of work. Make sure you allow for enough sampling locations to adequately assess the extent of contamination if it is present. this is important for maximizing the grant funding that can be used for the phase 2 work, and that applies to any of these activities. So groundwater sampling, that's another thing. If you suspect that contamination has reached groundwater, then include monitoring well installation and groundwater sampling and analysis in your scope of work. And again, also include a sufficient number of wells to be able to, assess the size of the dissolved plume that may be there, but also have enough locations to be able to evaluate the groundwater flow conditions across the site. That's equally important. Another thing to consider also is surface water and sediment sampling. So if there's a nearby surface water body like a lake or a river, stream, things like that, then consider including surface water and sediment sampling in your scope of work to assess the impact of site contaminants on those water resources. Vapor intrusion assessment, that's another one that can be done. Vapor intrusion refers to the migration of volatile chemicals from contaminated soil and groundwater into indoor air spaces. So these types of assessments involve sampling indoor air and also sometimes including a soil gas survey or soil gas sampling to evaluate the potential risks to human health from inhalation of the vapors. So if there's any buildings that are close by or on the property itself, or if future ones are planned, you may want to consider including this in your scope of work. Another thing that you can do is a geophysical survey, GPR survey, to if you need to try to locate any buried drums or tanks. And then risk assessment work is also done during these types of assessments, and that will help to determine what concentrations of those compounds are protective of human health and the environment. And then you can also include evaluating remediation options in your phase 2. So if contamination is identified, the phase 2 environmental site assessment may provide recommendations for appropriate remediation measures. And as Tamara had mentioned before, an evaluation of these types of remediation alternatives that can have different names. So in Washington, we call it a feasibility study. And as she mentioned before, what EPA requires for their cleanup grants, they call it an analysis of Brownfields cleanup alternatives, or ABCA. So make sure you know what the goal of your investigation is so that you can include the development of this type of document to evaluate and select an appropriate cleanup action as part of your scope. And then lastly, reporting should be part of the scope of work for an assessment. The findings and results of the investigation are typically compiled into a detailed report, which will include data analyses and interpretations, as well as providing conclusions and recommendations for any further investigation or remediation efforts. All right, next slide. So what happens after the phase 2 or site investigation? Have the goals been met? Is the investigation complete? Have site contaminants and affected media been identified and confirmed? Have exposure pathways and receptors been confirmed? Are the lateral and vertical extents of contamination sufficiently defined to select a cleanup action? An incomplete investigation or incomplete conceptual site model can really have a significant impact on cleanup costs during redevelopment and can cause project delays. So try to be as complete and comprehensive as possible when you're scoping out your phase 2 assessment. All right, so once you've completed the investigation and you feel confident that you can move to the next step, which is evaluating cleanup alternatives, you should be thinking about whether it's time to bring in the regulatory agency into the project if you haven't done so already. for larger projects, and especially for projects that might have some complex issues. It's always good practice to engage with the environmental regulatory agency early on in the investigation and cleanup process. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Marc so he can go through part 3 and regulatory agency's role.
Thank you very much, Tina. Hello, good morning, everybody. I am Marc Thomas with the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. I'll be covering part 3 of today's webinar. As already mentioned this morning, for the vast majority of sites that require assessment and cleanup, you'll be working predominantly with your respective state environmental agencies and conducting your activities in a manner consistent with the state's regulations and policies. So I'll spend a few minutes this morning introducing you to the Region 10 state environmental programs, their cleanup processes, and when you'll be working with them to address your site. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, each state has a regulatory agency that oversees the cleanup of contaminated sites within their respective states. And listed on the slide are the 4 environmental state agencies for Region 10. Many similarities exist between state programs, but each state is set up a little bit differently with its own defined cleanup processes and terminology, which we'll talk a little bit more as we move along here this morning. An initial question, though, which Tina touched on, is when do you need to reach out to your state regulator, or when does a regulator need to become involved? Usually at a minimum, the regulator needs to be notified at the moment when you first learn a release has occurred or after contamination has been confirmed at a particular site. In the Brownfields context, this usually occurs once the presence of contamination has been documented, usually after a phase 2 or after some initial sampling has occurred. However, it could be in your best interest to work with the state earlier. For example, if you're thinking about conducting a phase 1 with limited sampling at a site that doesn't have confirmed contamination yet, coordinating with the state in advance to make sure the sampling is done in a manner consistent with their regulations and guidance could ultimately save you time and money by ensuring that those results can be used in the future. Next slide, please. So again, state regulatory agencies oversee the cleanup of contaminated sites that are not federally managed, which represents the vast majority of contaminated sites out there. This simplified graphic generally follows the major steps of the circle process, or super fun, broadly speaking, and Region 10 states generally follow the same process, again, with some differences and different terminologies. But in general, the regulatory cleanup processes of any Region 10 state will follow these steps. Moving from left to right, remedial investigation, or for our purposes, what we're calling site assessment or characterization. Tina talked about this as well. Here we're trying to identify the nature and extent of contamination, thinking about what types of potential contaminants are present. We're dealing with hazardous substances, or is petroleum suspected, or both. What's the potentially contaminated media? Is it soil, groundwater, surface water, etc.? And then conducting a feasibility study. And here we're trying to determine the effectiveness of a potential remedial option, or in other words, will a particular remedy work as designed to meet the cleanup goals and protect human health and the environment? Is it practical? Is it implementable? How much is it going to cost? And how does potential cost weigh into the cleanup option that's eventually selected? And then once a particular remedy or cleanup option is selected, cleanup work plan should be drafted and reviewed and approved by the regulator to ensure that the cleanup, when implemented, will meet the cleanup objectives and work as designed. As part of that planning, the appropriate cleanup levels for the site are established, which depends on the types of contaminants at issue, potential exposure pathways, and how the site's ultimately going to be reused. And if the decision is made to leave some contaminants in place, will institutional controls or ICs be needed? And who's going to monitor and enforce those ICs agreed upon ahead of time? And then cleanup, where field work is conducted consistent with a work plan. If there are any deviations from that plan, those are noted and explained, kind of the rationale for those deviations given. The cleanup report is generated that documents the final results, subject to the regulator's review, comment, and ultimate approval. And if post-cleanup activities are needed and have been agreed upon ahead of time by the parties, things like long-term monitoring, O&M requirements, ICs, those post cleanup activities would continue into the future. Next slide, please. So getting to cleanup. Again, each state has different mechanisms to oversee their cleanup processes. Some important similarities exist regardless of what state you're working in. Each state program is voluntary to some extent, either through the availability of a formal voluntary cleanup program, or VCP, or voluntary in the sense that a party can conduct its own activities to assess or clean up their property, subject to state regulations with a certain degree of independence, with kind of an enforcement stick looming in the background as needed. But each Region 10 state also has a final decision document that marks the cleanup complete milestone, or that no further action is required. And a few quick notes for each state program. Alaska does not have a voluntary cleanup program per se, where a site owner or a responsible party pays into the program with an upfront fee. However, most assessment and cleanup work is undertaken on a voluntary basis without the need to employ enforcement tools, with ADEC, or Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation staff cost recovering for time spent reviewing work plans and reports, etc. In Idaho, most brownfield redevelopers utilize the state's VCP program. Projects conducted through the VCP typically result in a certificate of completion and covenant not to sue, both of which are recorded with the deed or deeds of the affected party. Oregon and Washington are similar in that they offer independent and voluntary cleanup program paths. They also offer formal agreements in which a site manager has oversight throughout every step of the process. Next slide, please. Under voluntary cleanup programs, state program involvement includes reviewing documents, work plans, and reports to make sure they are aligned with the state regulatory requirements. Depending on the state and the circumstances, this could be considered technical assistance or be cost recoverable. While every state may call their documents and steps something different, the cleanup process generally leads to the same end result. That is, having a cleanup plan that meets the appropriate state cleanup regulations and ultimately a decision document that certifies the cleanup is complete. In short, the best advice, contact your regulatory agency as soon as possible so that you don't have to do things twice. By asking your state agency to review your initial site assessment results to determine whether your recommended next steps are appropriate and in compliance with relevant regulations could save you time and money later. Also note that some states require certain documents be submitted for review and approval, while others do not. For example, Alaska requires review and approval of assessment work plans and reports, but does not usually require a feasibility study. Again, check with your state environmental agency regarding the specific requirements as soon as you possibly can. Next slide, please. In the next few slides, we've included several state-specific slides for future reference for most of the Region 10 states. So this diagram shows the general steps of the cleanup process in Alaska, including relevant citations to the Alaska Administrative Code and statutes for those who really want to do a deep dive, but of particular note, once a release is reported or contamination is confirmed, ADEC is notified that site is added and tracked on ADEC's contaminated sites database, which is publicly available. And there's a screen grab there on the right-hand side of the slide. For each site, a site summary is provided and major actions noted in the database. Next slide, please. And this diagram obviously shows the general steps in the cleanup process in Oregon. DEQ offers 3 pathways for review and approval of cleanups conducted by property owners: independent cleanup, voluntary cleanup, and site response. Independent and voluntary cleanup are for property owners who decide to clean up their property. The difference is that voluntary cleanup program sites are typically more complex and require more DEQ oversight than independent cleanup sites. In the site response program, DEQ requires cleanup through orders and potentially enforcement actions for higher priority sites. Next slide, please. And here's a very brownfield focused diagram of Washington's cleanup process. And this diagram shows the different types of EPA and state funding that may be able to apply for that you may be able to apply for when completing the different steps of the cleanup process. Next slide, please. Let's talk for a few minutes about the potential technical assistance resources or funding opportunities that may be available beyond the EPA MARC grants that Tamara highlighted up front. You may have heard of targeted brownfield assessments, or TBAs. EPA, through its TBA program, can provide communities and nonprofit organizations with free environmental assessments, cleanup planning, and visioning services for brownfield properties with reuse potential. TBAs are services that EPA provides and not grants. The distinction being that EPA, through its contractor, will conduct the assessment work and manage the project. But to learn more about whether a particular site is a candidate for a TBA, contact EPA Region 10. And the link there provided on the slide goes to more information about the general EPA TBA program. But from there, you can find the link directly to the Region 10 TBA website. EPA may also be able to provide reuse planning through its land revitalization and technical assistance program. Similar to TBAs, these are smaller technical assistance grants that are provided directly from Region 10. The Technical Assistance to Brownfields, or TAB program, is related but separate. Through TAB, EPA has cooperative agreements in place with specific organizations or providers that can assist communities increase their understanding of brownfields issues and potential funding opportunities. This technical assistance is available to all stakeholders, anyone with an interest in brownfields reuse and redevelopment. Technical assistance can range from planning to interpretation of environmental documents. It can be particularly helpful to communities that have limited resources to hire outside help or don't know how to obtain that help in the first place. In Region 10, CCLR, our host today, is our TAB provider, as well as Kansas State University is the national tribal TAB provider that can help tribes and tribal entities across the country, including Region 10 states. And then finally, state cleanup programs, which we'll talk about on the upcoming slides. Next slide, please. ADEC's Contaminated Sites program provides site-specific technical support through its DEC, Brownfield Assessment and Cleanup, or DBAC program. Similar to EPA's TBAs, or Targeted Brownfield Assessments, DEC provides DBAC services directly to awarded parties rather than as a grant. And services can include everything from assessment activities to cleanup and reuse planning to cleanup activities themselves. I'd point out, and this is specific to Alaska, that Alaska, well, we're talking about Alaska services here, but Alaska tribes are eligible to receive DBAC services. And this is an important distinction just to point out, as Alaskan tribes are expressly excluded from eligibility for EPA assessment, cleanup, and multipurpose grants, although Alaska Native Village and regional corporations are eligible. So just wanted to point that out for if there have any Alaska tribes or entities on the line that they are eligible for DBAC services through the state. Next slide, please. And then for reference, here's the Alaska Brownfields team and our contact information. Please check out our website if you want more information about brownfields in Alaska. The link is there on the slide, as well as a couple of resources to learn more about the state of brownfields in our great state. Next slide, please. Idaho's voluntary cleanup program was created to encourage reuse of brownfields in that state specifically. However, other state programs may be available to help address contaminated sites in Idaho depending upon site-specific circumstances, such as through their LUST program or leaking underground storage tanks program, or if hazardous waste is involved, potentially under Idaho's RCRA program. Which program is involved depends on the amount and type of material released and the type of closure that the responsible party or property owner wants. As previously mentioned, cleanups performed under Idaho's VCP typically result in a certificate of completion and covenant not to sue. Next slide, please. Oregon DEQ's cleanup program, which Brownfields is housed within, is primarily funded by cost recovery. Essentially, the responsible party pays for the assessment and cleanup of brownfields and other cleanup sites. For eligible properties that need assistance, DEQ relies on grant funding received by the EPA to assist parties with conducting site assessments and cleanup planning. In addition to the EPA grant funds, DEQ partners with the Oregon Health Authority for outreach and risk communication, as well as Business Oregon for funding sampling, cleanup, and redevelopment planning. Next slide, please. And for reference, here's a list of the Oregon Brownfields contacts per region across the state. Next slide, please. Like Oregon, Washington has a variety of funding sources. This table summarizes the sources of that funding and what they can be used for, from planning, assessment, and/or cleanup. Note that there are different state agencies that offer funding mechanisms, including the Department of Ecology, Department of Commerce, and the Pollution Liability Insurance Agency, which is not a state agency that helps owners and operators meet, which is a state agency that helps owners and operators meet financial responsibility and environmental cleanup requirements for underground storage tanks. Next slide, please.
This site is located in Washington State in Cedar-Woolley, and it's just west of the Cascade Mountains, called the Swift Center or the Cedar-Woolley Innovation for Tomorrow Center. It is located what was before the Northern State Hospital campus, and it was built in 1912 as a self-sustained community with its own farm, creamery shop, powerhouse, kind of they call like a modern marvel with more than 400 employees, some of which were living at the site. However, because of all these different activities that occur in this property, there was a lot of contamination from multiple different sources left when the hospital closed. So the Port of Skagit acquired the property in 2018. And since then, they have searched for funding and assistance, and they have phased out the different investigations and cleanups of the different areas and sources that they had on property. So with partners like City of Cedar-Woolley, Skagit County, Department of Ecology, and Department of Enterprise Services and others, they have obtained funding and assistance to revitalize the campus. And they've entered into regulatory agreements like the ones that Marc talked to us about. And the plan and the community vision is to redevelop the property as a mixed-use campus that accommodates education, research, development, manufacturing, hospitality, and commercial venues. Next slide, please. And this slide summarizes, and it is non-comprehensive, but it does give you kind of a glimpse of all the different funding sources that they have obtained since 2014, even before the Port of Skagit acquired the property. They were able to get through Ecology an integrated planning grant. Then they also got EPA's brownfield assessment as well as cleanup grants. They got remedial action grants from Ecology. They also got funding through the Pollution Liability Insurance Agency that Marc mentioned as a resource in Washington State. And all of these sources of funding have been used to go through that process that Tina talked to us about, where you do this iterative process of reviewing your CSM and finding, did you answer all the questions that you needed to answer, to go back to the start, investigate additional contamination if you found some more. So all of these sources of funding have helped with that. I mean, fortunately for this side, or maybe not fortunately, but the fact that it is a big campus and they have been able to face all these different areas and done investigation separately, it may be a good thing as they've been able to do it in phases. But this applies to any site. You can phase investigations and your process at any site. Next slide, please. This is a picture of 2021, the Swift Center, and this is the cleanup in progress, or one of the cleanups. This was arsenic in surface soil. So I just wanted to give you a glimpse of what it looks like more recently. And next slide, please. And to close up, and maybe your takeaways and final thoughts is plan ahead, do your homework. Always think of where you want to end and begin with your final goal in mind. Do your homework, review existing information, maps, historical data, Find out as much as you can about the property so you have an idea of what you should be looking for in that phase 2, in that investigation, what you need to consider when you're developing your conceptual site model. And if you know nothing, then you know nothing and you start from zero, but it's important that you've done that homework. Assessments can cover most of the site investigation, and it can cover also a lot of the planning steps. So it's important that you prioritize what is really important and keep that goal in mind. Understand what you can do as part of your funding and what you can't do. Also develop your regulatory strategy. When is the right time to contact Ecology or DEC or Idaho DEQ or Oregon DEQ? You want to make sure that you time that adequately, because you don't want to go to them and find out that it's going to take a long time to review the documents, or that their cleanup complete determination or no further action determination is going to take a long time and you weren't prepared for that. So make sure you think of that carefully and you strategize and you manage your expectations, because if they say it's going to take us 3 months to review the documents and you were hoping to start a different part of the project in 3 months, then that's not going to work. So make sure you do all that ahead of time and know the boundaries of your funding sources. Make sure you understand what your funding can cover and what it can't. There's funding that can cover certain things and not others. Cleanup funding can't cover in general demolition. Sometimes it can under certain specific conditions. So you just have to look really closely at those specific questions. And finally, just use CCLR's assistance whenever you need it. We're here to help. So make sure you have our contact information, and there will be links on the presentation as you get it on the email. So I'm going to finish now, and we have a few minutes for any additional remaining questions. So please feel free to put them in the Q&A, or let's see, they may have been deleted when we restarted. So I ask, if you don't see your question there, type it back in or add any additional comments that you may have in the chat. And we'll be happy to answer questions. And the whole panel is available to answer questions.
Hey, Tamara, this is Tina. I can't seem to restart my video, but there was a question that was in the Q&A that I was in the process of typing an answer to when we got dropped there. Mike had asked who the, what did he say? What technical experts typically prepare the conceptual site model? I think that's what he asked.
I saw that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I was just going to say that, it's typically your environmental professionals, your environmental geologists and engineers, hydrogeologists, scientists, those that are typically in the consulting field, I would say, that typically put those together. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think it's generally consultants, and they will be, you would have environmental engineers, environmental scientists, hydrogeologists, geologists, and it'll generally be somebody that has some expertise in contaminated sites and feed and transport of contaminants. Any other questions? We have 2 questions now from Richard. In Alaska, I worry about underreporting of brownfields for fear of liability, especially with private property owners, since any kind of property can be a brownfield. Industrial and commercial properties seem to get access to funding, but private property owners are scrutinized to set if they're responsible parties. So people are fearful. Are there any financial resources available? Mark, are you here?
I am here. I mean, I'm thinking that's more broad an issue than just Alaska, right? If we're thinking about private property owners. I'll have to think on that, Richard. Nothing comes to mind off the top of my head, at least specific to brownfields, but maybe we can be a little creative, right? And go beyond some of the EPA, MARC grants and 128A types of funding and think more broadly about that. So Richard, let me think on that now. I'll get back to you. Unless others have, Tamara or others have any insights.
I'll chime in general, and this is not just, Richard, this is not just an issue for Alaska, so thank you for bringing it up. You're correct, and that is why there is that, in terms of for federal funding, there is that circular, what they call circular liability defense, and why the phase one becomes really important, because having that phase one essentially identifies the issues ahead of time, and then it says, oh, I'm purchasing this property, and it was already contaminated when I purchased it. So the phase one kind of gives you that. However, that's for federal funding and for federal circular liability. That doesn't protect from liability from states. Each state has a different regulation. So when you say, are there any financial resources available? There are resources available to help do the assessment, potentially to do the cleanup. But however, if the property is acquired by a particular entity, they may still be liable under the state law, depending on the state. And that's what Marc will look a little bit more into for specific to Alaska. We have another question from Joelle. When did you get the state involved? And that is
Tamara, can I real
Yes.
quickly, I just from the Oregon perspective, I want to follow up on that really great question. And if, for the Oregon folks out there, let's just have the conversation. If you have a question about what funding may be out there, please reach out to myself or any of the Brownfield coordinators that are on the slide for Oregon DEQ, as well as Business Oregon. And Margaret Olson with EPA Region 10 is a great resource. Sometimes there have been properties where, at least for assessments, we're able to provide funding through our 128A state response grant that we get from EPA, provided that there's some entity that is not responsible for the contamination, but they may be interested in the property. And so they want to do an assessment and to determine, like, is there contamination there and does it pose a risk? And so we can potentially help out with that. Even if it's a private property owner, because there might be a public entity or some sort of public benefit reuse potential that is being considered for that property. So don't count it out, don't self-select out. Let's have the conversation and go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Ali, you want to add anything else for Washington?
I think I would just second what Rebecca said. Contact us if you're curious about what funding resources might be available to you, because especially in Washington, we may be able to direct you, even if it doesn't come from ecology. There may be other agencies that have funding for your specific project, and it's hard to know and hard to navigate all the different options without some guidance. It can be complex.
Thanks, Ali. And that essentially kind of tells me that for other states out there and for other people attending that maybe from other states, I would say that's a good idea. Just contact somebody in the state and see what's available. So I would encourage you to do that. And the last question I wanted to address from Joelle is, when did you get the state involved? Marc talked about get the state involved as early as you can when you know that there is contamination. And I would probably say the same, and that is probably the best time to get the state, and maybe not involved, but informed and start laying out what you plan to do with the property. Because like I said, there are times when their timing it's not in line with yours, and developers may want to go fairly fast, and the state may not be prepared to go fast. So I would say as soon as you can. Anybody else want to add anything?
I just agree with exactly what you're saying there. The development timelines are generally compressed, and the cleanup process, at least here in Washington, can take some time to get through that remedial investigation phase to get everything fully characterized adequately, at least to, select your cleanup action. So yeah, they just need to be aware of that.
Great. Thank you, Tina. And thanks, Richard, for your comment. That I did not know that. He says he's learned that homeowners insurance companies can offer a rider for oil tanks, but they don't have to advertise it. And then realtors don't ask for an AAI. So that's interesting. Anyone else has any comments or things they want to add? Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panel for answering questions and for dealing with the little glitch, but we are we're here. Thanks everybody for attending, and you should be receiving an email, and there will be an evaluation form that pops up when the webinar ends. So please give us some feedback on that. Really appreciate your attendance.